Tiny, pocketable handhelds are some of my favorite to look at on this channel. A handheld emulator that you can just throw in your pocket or always have available in your bag for a quick gaming session is something that I rely on constantly. The Miyoo Mini is a device that I just always have with me. It's tiny, but not too tiny like the Funkey S or the RG Nano. Those are cool, but they're definitely not quite as practical for a wide range of games. The Miyoo Mini, on the other hand, has a pretty good screen size, comfortable controls, and it's powered by the custom firmware Onion OS, which makes it nearly perfect. Miyoo as a company, at least in its current form, hasn't really released many devices. They had a bunch of iterations on the Miyoo Mini, and they have the very successful Miyoo Mini Plus. The Miyoo Mini has become a commodity because of how hard it is for them to keep it in stock. The Miyoo Mini Plus is readily available, but there's just something about the smaller sized Mini that I personally prefer. Miyoo's latest device, the Miyoo A30, doesn't have as catchy of a name, but don't let that fool you. This could be all the great things I love about the Miyoo Mini in a horizontal form factor, and even with some additional features. The Miyoo A30 doesn't have a fancy name or come in fancy packaging, but it's great that it came with its own case. It also has a little pocket that has the included microSD card, a USB-C charging cable, and a USB-C to 3.5mm headphone jack. The A30 comes in 4 different colorways. There's the red and gold, which is very Famicom reminiscent, black with a white stripe at the bottom, black and white, which gives the front accents around the buttons a white backing, and gray. To be honest, I don't love any of these color schemes. I personally prefer a solid device color over these designs with like a racing stripe. The Famicom style red and gold is a fun callback, but I just prefer the previous colors of Miyoo devices over these designs. The Famicom style just feels a little bit overused at this point. Spec-wise, the A30 has an all-winner A33 CPU, a 2.8-inch IPS screen with a resolution of 640 by 480, 512GB of RAM, built-in Wi-Fi, and a 2600 mAh battery. The A30 is available to purchase on AliExpress for $50, which is where I picked mine up. Quantities seem a little bit limited though. Keep Retro also has the A30 listed for sale for $55 and says they'll ship it before June 25th. So it could be a while to get one, but at least Keep Retro is a known shop. This is actually not the first time we've seen this chipset. The Pocket Go S30 also has this exact same chipset, which is also made by Miyoo before they were called Miyoo. The controller on the A30 feels really good. The D-pad feels solid, and I don't feel any accidental diagonals. The ABXY buttons are rubber membranes, so they feel pretty good, and they're a pretty good size too, considering the small footprint of the A30. The start and select buttons are located underneath the ABXY buttons, and that feels like a pretty good placement. Although after playing for a bit on the A30, I actually wish that the start and select buttons were swapped. Below the D-pad, we've got an analog stick. An analog stick on such a tiny device is funny to see, but I definitely see the usefulness depending on what games you want to play. I did notice that the analog stick was a little bit off with its calibration, but luckily that's easy to recalibrate in the settings. My only nitpick here is that I wish the screen was flat to the device instead of this slight indent, which feels like it's just there to cover up the bezels, and I don't think the bezels really would have been that noticeable. At the top of the device, we've got side-by-side shoulder buttons. I was actually surprised that they're soft feeling, not clicky micro switches like we usually see on these kinds of devices, and they actually feel pretty good. At the top of the device is also where we'll find a home button, a USB-C port for charging, and a volume rocker. At first, my volume down needed to be pressed super hard to register, but now it's like broken in or something, and it does feel fine. I wouldn't call this a build quality issue until more of these units are out in the public, and we can see if that's a common problem, but definitely a weird thing to keep in mind. The right side of the device has 2 LEDs and a power button. At the bottom is the microSD card slot. You'll notice that there is no 3.5mm headphone jack, which is why they included that USB-C to 3.5mm converter. In general, I'm a huge fan of this device's overall design. The size makes it perfectly pocketable. The build quality feels great and durable, just further making it possibly the perfect throw-it-in-your-bag device. When I first went to power on the A30, it took me a moment to realize you have to hold the power button down for a full 5 seconds. It seems a bit long, but at least it boots up fairly fast after that. Miyoo's devices have historically seen the custom firmware Onion OS released for both Miyoo Mini and Miyoo Mini Plus. While we don't have Onion OS yet, I'm hopeful that we'll see it one day. In the meantime, we've got the stock OS, which honestly actually isn't so bad. There's two sections for selecting games, Game and RetroArch. Usually this is because the Game option contains standalone emulators and RetroArch is for cores. For the A30 though, it's actually using RetroArch for both. There are still some standalone emulators like for PSP, but I like the concept that the Game section is a quick boot up a game and go, while RetroArch is more if you want nuanced controls over the core you're booting up your game with. This ease of use carries over to the entire software experience actually. The A30 is incredibly easy to navigate, so you can just focus on gaming. A quick sleep function is something you figure is standard on these devices, but I did want to mention that the sleep works great on the A30, which is perfect again for a pick up and go device. It's definitely an important factor, at least for me. As far as more advanced features for the A30, we also have the option in settings to overclock the CPU. You can do this to push a little bit more performance out of the A30, but at the cost of a warmer device and reduced battery life. I like the prospect that the A30 has built-in Wi-Fi support too. Right now, other than RetroArch NetPlay, it feels a little bit underutilized, but hopefully Onion OS will open up that capability in the future. There's even a robust number of themes to choose from. Although, this is also where I have to start some of my nitpicks. I actually somehow bugged my OS and got stuck in a theme, and now I can't change it to anything else, even with a factory reset. I also couldn't get Pico 8 games to launch, and eventually after trying to modify some shell scripts, the Pico 8 option just disappeared entirely. Also, in a future update, let's spell arcade properly, please. There's also a weird bug in the firmware where sometimes if I wake the device from sleep or unplug it from charge, it will start reactivating the background music even though I have it set to 0. All of these issues should be easy software updates as long as Miyoo follows up with some enhancements. We can also take a quick look at the games included on the 64GB microSD card. It's packed with games, but the quality varies. NES has 690 games, but also that includes Angry Birds 1 through 4, so I don't know if that really counts. Game Boy Advance at least prioritizes Pokemon games at the top of the list, and we've got hundreds to choose from. Game Boy and Game Boy Color combined have over 700 games. We've got over 1,000 games for Super Nintendo, and a surprising number of PlayStation 1 games. Interestingly, there are no N64 games included on the microSD card, even though this device does have emulation support for it. I always share the same opinion about these preloaded cards though. It's just too many games to parse through. Maybe it's good if you don't have a ROM collection to start from, but at the very least you're probably going to want to plug that microSD card into your computer and delete some of that junk. It does bother me that these ROM dumps that are included also seemingly have no logic. We can use the search, but even then the results are hit or miss. For example, if we do a search for Zelda, we can see that it's padded a bit because we have tons of duplicates. Getting into how well the A30 handles gaming, I want to call out one performance issue with this device. Retro GameCore shared some insight that Super Nintendo has fairly poor performance out of the box because of a RetroArch setting that's configured by default. If you launch a Super Nintendo game, hit the menu button, go to Settings, Video, remove Video Filter, and you should see some better SNES gaming. Make sure you save your overrides by going to the root of the menu, select Overrides, then choose Save Content Directory Override. I'll be doing my testing with this change. Trust me, it's needed. Let's start with the basics and work our way up. NES works and looks great. Genesis is a bunch of fun here too. Game Boy and Game Boy Color look great here, especially if you tweak your emulator settings to have palette colorization. Game Boy Advance feels right at home on the A30 because of this Game Boy Micro-esque form factor, and we have pretty small letterboxing too, which is great to see. PlayStation 1 runs no problem here. I recently actually had some trouble testing Crash Bash on some devices, but it runs great on the A30. Nintendo 64 is a weird one. We're missing one more analog stick for a full N64 controller, but if you're willing to figure out playing games without a C-stick, some games will be playable. But by default, if you just boot up an N64 game, you'll find that even easier games to emulate like Mario Kart 64 can't hit full speed. But if we go into settings and bump our CPU frequency to 1344 and then start up Mario Kart again, it actually runs pretty well. It's not perfect, but in a race, I haven't seen any slowdown that's too concerning. I actually can't show the FPS for N64 because enabling it in RetroArch will crash it, but from a feeling perspective, there are definitely some games that you'll find fully playable. Interestingly, PSP emulation is supported on the A30. You'll have to keep that CPU frequency maxed out, which does seem to have a very significant impact on battery life. But hey, if you're craving some burnout on a tiny handheld, this kind of gets the job done. Sure, the aspect ratio of PSP is wrong for the screen size, but hey, it works and it's not so bad. You're not going to be able to play the full PSP library on here or anything like that. God of War is out of the question for sure, but you may find a few games that are good to keep around on the A30 just in case you get a PSP itch. The Miyoo A30 is a solid follow-up to the Miyoo Mini. I like the horizontal form factor, and I appreciate the even more portable nature of the A30 over the Mini. The controls feel great, and the analog stick, even though its uses are fairly limited, is a nice to have feature. Even though N64 and PSP are a little bit hit or miss, just the fact that you can play them at all in such a tiny form factor is really impressive. I'm really glad to see that Super Nintendo works perfect on the A30 after turning off those filters, and I hope that Miyoo corrects this in a future update. The software quirks aren't terrible, although the Pico 8 one I would consider more of a breaking issue just because of how cumbersome it is to launch a Pico 8 game through the RetroArch menu directly. I also wish I got stuck on a better theme. But these are all things that I can live with for the convenience of such a small portable device that does have an impressive number of features. If small pocketable devices are up your alley, this is a very easy device to recommend. It's going to be a bit harder of a decision for me when I throw a tiny device in my bag. It used to be the Miyoo Mini hands down, but the A30 is going to give the Mini a run for its money. But that's just my opinion. What do you think of the Miyoo A30? Do you like horizontal form factors over vertical? Are you considering buying the A30? Are you waiting for a different form factor? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you like this video, give me a follow on Twitch where I unbox and test these devices live there. Subscribe here on YouTube if you want to see more reviews, and thanks for watching. Back to the A30 for me.